Mark, I would like to begin our conversation by stealing a theme from the last chapter of your book. And I think you've titled it, The Journeys We Must Take Together. Now, in such a polarized society, we know via the World Bank, Oxfam, and we can quote other studies as well, that we do have the highest inequality in the world. And when you talk about the journeys we must take together, in this context of inequality and exclusion, but also of corruption, because when I talk about how we need to fix systemic racism and exclusion, somebody's justified in saying, well, I'm doing my best, but the government is stealing money from the people, so corruption is the enemy. But somebody else will say corruption is not the biggest issue. The big issue is that when I go to corporate South Africa, nobody looks like me, nobody sounds like me. In a society as polarized and as diverse as ours, is it possible to take a common journey? Or are you suggesting that we can take different journeys in our private little corners, but they can all lead us to the same place of social justice and redemption? What are your thoughts?
I think we have a common journey in the sense that the Constitution maps out a vision of a socially just society, an equal society, a society where there's dignity. And the Constitution is so much more than a law. For me, it's an ethic, and it's a set of values, and it's something that the people who worked on it at the outset of this society held up for us to strive to. The problem is I don't think that many people have really thought about what those values require, because many people continue in this society as they lived before, particularly many people of privilege and many people of wealth. But as we hold up that common vision, how we journey to that common vision is something we have to each decide for ourselves. And as far as I'm concerned, there's a million paths to it, but you've got to be on one path. You've got to be taking it on somewhere. And that's what people have to identify. When we say that I say to people now, activism is not a matter of choice anymore. Mm-hmm. You know, when I was a kid, I could have lived a nice, middle, comfortable white person's life after going to Oxford and stuff like that. I don't think that young people, even privileged young people, can have that choice anymore, because this inequality is going to blow you all up. Climate change is going to blow us all up. So you better find what is your particular bit of space, but we have to help people to get there.
How do we do that without alienating people? You talked about donors just a few minutes ago, and there's a way in which different sectors of society engage with each other. So I listened to President Ramaphosa speaking to investors, and he will reassure them that there'll be no land grabs in South Africa. And then he'll go to a township somewhere, and he will not be quite as unequivocal. He'll say something else, and you kind of have to replay it to think, okay, what does he mean? What is he saying? And so on. So there are always these competing interests. There are always different messages in order to get buy-in. How do you get buy-in towards this common vision without compromising the message and the core values?
Well, I think you have to get people to realize our common humanity, first of all. I think you have to get people to re-establish empathy with each other. We've lost empathy. So you see a little kid on a street corner. You don't think what if that was my child, the pain, the suffering of that child. With the breakdown of empathy, you're cold. You've got to rebuild that empathy. But then we have to find different languages without, as you say, compromising or weakening. But often we use languages that alienate our people. And I was thinking about this a lot. You know, as you know, Redi, I was on this Joburg to Sea bike ride with one of my comrades here, Busi Msumango, which was like 90% white people. And as we were riding across the land of our country, a lot of land, I was struck by
Did you take it?
Yeah, well, we did. But I was struck by two things. First, one thing was that those white people that we were with were not bad white people, right? And yet they would often have expressed quite reactionary views on these things. How do you penetrate those things in order to get people to begin to think differently? But what I think we fail in this country as well, this is where Cyril Ramaphosa has failed and all the leadership are failing, is by actually inspiring people with with what South Africa could possibly be, and saying this is what South Africa could possibly be, not just for South Africans, and we have a lot of resources in this country, but for the world again. We could be an inspiration to the world on non-racialism. We could be an inspiration to the world on building new economies that respect human rights. Cyril Ramaphosa could now say, before he starts going down the path of failed economic policies, which is what he's going to do in all probability, before he starts going down that way, he can start saying, that failed. We've seen it hasn't done anything anywhere. Let's think new economies of human rights. Now, you may think that I'm just being an idealist and I'm being utopian, but let's build ideas around utopianism. I mean, Rick Turner, who you know was murdered in 1977 as well, made a virtue out of utopianism and the idea of dreaming and building better societies rather than stigmatizing those ideas. Set out the dream and then say to people, how do we get there?
All right, let's just be very frank here. We've just had an election a week ago. So I want to share with you what is being whispered in the corridors of privilege. It is all these municipalities that are broken down, that have been most affected by corruption. They voted overwhelmingly for the ANC. And of course, it's not the job of activists and NGOs to tell people how to vote. That's not what we are about. But there's a point at which there is intersectionality. All these worlds collide with each other. So I'm busy on social media, and I see how people are responding to the water crisis in Makhanda. Just today, the story that Gift of the Givers were meant to receive some government funds, but people in power paid themselves, and there was some corruption going on. And there was another story in the Daily Maverick just 2 days after the elections. And I spent a lot of time that day just looking at all the reaction across color lines, age groups. Everyone's response, or the majority of people were responding, we don't want to get involved. Let them drink that dirty water. They voted for the ANC. Let them suffer. They voted for the ANC. So perhaps it is too soon after the election. Next year, next month, we'll be having a different conversation. I'm raising that example because there's a way in which political outcomes create a disengagement of some sort. And I stayed with that particular issue because it really, really worried me. That do we punish the most vulnerable citizens because of the political outcome in that political process? Or is there a way in which we, I don't know, disrespect the poor by claiming that they're not thinking about their democracy, they're not thinking about their identity, they're not voting responsibly? But to be honest, that's exactly what's been happening. Every time there's a story now, a week after the elections, about a school, about an ambulance that didn't arrive, the response is, who did they vote for? So I'm asking you a whole lot of things about empathy, staying engaged, but also the challenge for NGOs, for activists such as yourself, to communicate differently, perhaps, with communities. Are you working hard enough to demonstrate the link between their daily grind and corruption or the actions of the powerful? And by powerful, I don't just mean government. I mean even the mining companies that want to go into Kolobeni, for example.
So Redi asked many questions.
I'm sorry.
No, but it's fine because they're all important, and I don't pretend that I've got the answers to them. But and perhaps Umanyana or the audience later can address some of those. I want to say two things. The first is that, again, I mean, it's sad. It's a tragedy that type of shallow blaming thought exists within society. And we need to be able to hold up a mirror to people's prejudices and people's stupidities And we have to think about how to do that better. I mean, I see my friend Mike van Graan, the playwright here, you know, it's about new languages as well that help, that aren't just the old stuff that people don't listen to in order to be able to get people to think and to look inside themselves. But it also, for me, raises perhaps a strategic question of self-criticism. And I've been challenged on this before by some of my friends and comrades and critics, which is, you know, sometimes organizations like Section27 and Mark Heywood have a kind of savior complex. Let's go into the poorest areas and work in the most depraved areas of Limpopo to help poor black people realize constitutional rights, etc., etc. Why aren't we going into some of the privileged areas? Why aren't we going to some of these people who hold these views and challenging these views? Not at the outset in a hostile way, but helping people to think differently, helping people again to realize their power. If your kid goes to one of these extremely posh, beautiful schools, St. John's or one of these places, what's your duty as that school to the schools where Michael went to? How can you just write off responsibility for that? So I can't give you answers, Redi. I don't pretend that these are the questions, if you like, that you're asking.
Before I get to you, Umanyana, I do want to ask you something. I never asked you this at your book launch. I'm moving to a different theme. I was actually taken aback by how wounded you were during the Zuma Must Fall anti-corruption marches of a couple of years ago. I suppose we've seen Mark, we've traveled with you, we've read about you, we've seen the fruits of your work, you and your comrades, and one is not suggesting that you are invincible. But as a friend, I was taken aback by how hurt you were when you were accused of having a white agenda. And it's ridiculous now, right? But at the time, when you communicated that to me, I thought, come on, Mark, everybody knows that's not true. But I replayed the conversation and I remembered the look on your face. You were actually devastated. And it challenged me to be a bit more tender. But to also question whether there was a part of you that had an identity crisis. Did you feel, as a South African, that you were being, dislocated, that you were being questioned? I had expected you, based on everything that you've done for South Africa, based on the people that you've challenged across classes and races, that you'd have been able to just stare it down and tell them to bugger off. But your devastation and hurt told me a whole lot of stories. What was going on there? Why did that hurt? You've been called a whole lot of things. Why did that hurt?
I think you've described it. Look, it's easy.
Are you crying?
No.
Oh.
Maybe. You know, it's easier to be... when somebody calls you an agent of a pharmaceutical company, you can deal with that.
That's worse.
Yeah, well, it's not actually, because it's such nonsense.
Yeah.
You know, when we were called, we had a regime change agenda and so on. That's what Thabo Mbeki and people said in the early days of the AIDS struggle. So it went on for a long time. But I think that often white people white activists must have an identity crisis. They must be constantly asking questions about themselves and their role and their privilege. So it was two things, if you like. One was, well, how do you answer that without actually sounding like the thing you're being accused of being? Yeah? So it has a sort of silencing effect. And then you just feel frustrated because you think you put so much energy into doing this and you were there. I mean, I can look at some of the people, and the particular march, there were two marches where we were accused of that. The first march was the march that we pulled together after the sacking of Nhlanhla Nene, and it was on December the 18th, and even my comrades, by the way, attacked us for doing that, for doing that march. But actually that march was Zwelenzima Vavi, it was me, it was you, and you were there. You saw what that march was like. So when people said this was just a march of dissatisfied white people protecting their privileges, it wasn't. But you couldn't really say, couldn't easily say that it wasn't. And then the same happened in a different way, not quite as painfully, with the march that we organized on April the 7th in Pretoria at the height of the Zuma Must Fall. And really was that march, I think, that catalyzed so much. But again, the march was misrepresented. But the identity crisis that you often feel, and it's a difficult thing to deal with, is, okay, so what do I do? Shut up? Give up? Go back into a hole somewhere and just watch it all go by? I'm struggling with your question, Redi, because it's not something that I've resolved very easily, because it is painful and difficult at times.